Joy Jangdhari and welcome to our show. And I'm here with author Carol Psaros. We will be discussing Carol's book, Chickens and Mosquitoes, The Art of Uncertain Times. It's a love story set in Depression Day, Delaware.
Well, it's a neat story. You know, growing up, I heard my parents talk about the Depression or mention it, and then they would say terrible times, and they would move on. They would never talk about terrible times because nobody wants to focus on that. Fast forward 60 years, when I had time to go to school, get married, work, grow up, retire, moved to Bethany Beach, unpack boxes, I finally had time to look at my dad's scrapbooks.
Wow.
My dad was a historian. He loved history. He taught high school history. And I unpacked his scrapbooks and started reading. And I was truly amazed at what I found. Joy, this is one of my dad's 2 scrapbooks. It's very old and it's starting to fall apart. But on this page is the Civilian Conservation Corps News from September 1933. And the headline is Captain Schwenholt Commands Delaware Camp. And because my dad was a historian at heart, and he had some writing skills, he was selected to be the camp reporter. And I became fascinated with the early history of the broiler industry, chickens. And so the idea started to form in my head that I really needed to tell this story of 1930 Depression time in Delaware. And I decided to make it a love story based on my parents' lives. Joy, my first book was called Come Back to Bethany. And it's about Bethany Beach, Delaware, where I live, in 3 different centuries, and about 3 10-year-old girls who live completely separated from each other, but how their lives are connected. What life was like in Native American times, in Victorian times, and in modern day times. And so it's really the history of Bethany Beach and how it became a town and turned into the wonderful place that it is today, and about the reason why families still come back to Bethany. Joy, I had the letters that my mother wrote to my father. And of course my father, being the historian that he was, saved every one of them. Unfortunately, my mother's letters, her handwriting is very teeny, it's hard to read, and she was not the writer or the composer that my dad's letters, I had one that he wrote to her, asked more or less the week before they were married. So it was a very loving letter, which I put into the book. And that was in his beautiful script, his beautiful handwriting. If I had had his letters, I truly would have had the love story down, because it would have been all there, but not in my mother's letter. She talks about the craziest things. And she, you know, my mother was not one looking to get married, you know, and she was not a romantic person like my dad. So I just would give anything to have. My mother did not save my dad's letters except that one, which I have. I'm glad that I do have it.
And how about here? He had such a beautiful handwriting.
Oh, he did.
We see this.
Yeah, he always did, his whole life. Yeah, there it is. I'm sure he was taught in the, what was it called? The Palmer method, yes. I'm sure all that the Delaware school children were taught at that time. There's a whole history here. My dad was not unusual when you look at the numbers of men that went through the CCC. And I just feel so lucky to have these original documents. Near the end of the book, that's not my mother, that's another friend, I guess, that he had. I have his selective service. Oh, they must be in the other scrapbook. I have 12 of his selective service cards. You know, every male had to carry a card with them.
Yes.
Once the war started, saying what their draft status was, and his kept changing every month. So I have all of those cards while he was working at the DuPont plant, because he could have been called up, you know, at any time.
That's great. How many books do you have?
I have 2 big scrapbooks, and then I have a lot of other documents. The reason the book is called The Art of Uncertain Times is literally features the art of Jack Lewis. Jack Lewis was a painter, a young man who had gone to college, got a degree, and so it's really a book about art and about his friendship with my dad. This is Jack Lewis's book, The Delaware Scene, which he published in 1940. And it includes sketches he made while he was in the Civilian Conservation Corps and a lot of others as well. And for each painting that he did, he included a page of explanation, the title, the historic place, the composition, and the philosophy. And it was those philosophies that I picked from to organize my story in Chickens and Mosquitoes. And so at the time he published it, he looked like this. This is a news article from 1940 that was in my dad's scrapbook, and he was just about ready to release this book, The Delaware Scene, which is quite a historic book. It has color plates in it as well as black and white, and just includes so many places around the state in 1935. Important places. He did historic buildings, and it's a remarkable book. If anybody has a copy of it, you should hold on to it. After I wrote the book, I looked back and I realized that his philosophies that he incorporated into this book in 1940 really give the essence of how people thought back in the Depression, what they were thinking about. Even though he was talking about a picture he had done, it was quite progressive for its time.
His philosophy.
To include a philosophy in a book about art. So anybody who met Jack Lewis, he lived to be almost 100 years old. He just died a couple of years ago. So he lived a lot longer than my dad. I think he was a couple of years younger than my dad. But he was a remarkable talent and a very vivacious human being, you know, and he looked like the stereotype of an artist. He always had a braid. On his older years, he had white hair, he had a braid on his head. He was 6'3", he was very tall, slim man, and he was quite an image.
He had a very unique look.
This is a sketch of himself that Jack Lewis did. I'm not sure of the year, but it shows him tromping over Delaware with his knapsack and his artist pad. And this is very typical of Jack Lewis. People who know him saw him everywhere throughout not just Sussex County, but throughout the state. In the 30s and 40s, he was out there sketching. He probably, more than any other Delaware artist, his volume of work, he was very prolific. He would do a sketch and a painting very quickly. And so, because of him, we have a real record of what Delaware was like during the Depression. At the very end of my book, I deal with the build-up for the war.
Yes.
During the war, the government took over the chicken industry. In other words, they said, you're going to send all our chickens to the troops, and they set a price. So it was good and it was bad for the chicken farmers at that time. But if we hadn't started the chicken industry in the 20s and the 30s, learned how to grow chickens in mass, we might not have won that war, because literally we sent so much protein over to Europe and to the South Pacific that it was a huge asset to the United States. The early chicken houses had lots of water fountains in them. This is an early water fountain, and it's a very heavy ceramic pot. The farm wife would have to go in, turn this upside down, and believe me, it's heavy, bring in a bucket of water and ladle or pour the water into this ceramic pot called a water fountain. Then she would put this lid on, which is also heavy, and then she would flip it over and set it all the way down on the ground. I'm just going to put it on this table. And then the chickies would come up, and the gravity feed, the water would come out the hole, and the chicken would come up and get the water that way until they lapped it all up. But this was intensive work, as was lugging around 80-pound feed bags. So working in an early chicken house, and in the summer it got real hot, they brought in blocks of ice. In the winter they had to shovel coal to keep the chickens warm. So it was hard work. So I think it's a remarkable story, American story, that we could still learn from today.
I like that we can still learn from. That's the amazing.
It's an era, the Depression time everywhere, in every state, is an era worth studying because it tells us of resilient hearts that didn't wring their hands and give up. And that training, that discipline that we had through the Depression, the terrible times that my parents talked about, prepared us for World War II. The book is available on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and then in bookstores in Sussex County, Delaware. And I know that a lot of people aren't near here, but if you go to Rehoboth Beach or Lewis Beach on your vacation, the bookstores you could pick up a copy of my book.
Thank you, Carol, so much for joining us.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
It was such a pleasure.